How did Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword influence the earliest days of Dungeons and Dragons? Appendix N chat is a series where I talk about books Gary Gygax mentioned in his 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide as a special inspirations to him for the development of D&D. And Paul Anderson's the other really famous book off that list mentioned by Gygax, I think he mentions High Crusade as well, but is Three Hearts and Three Lions. Already reviewed that and given an Appendix N chat on that on the channel. But there's really obvious massive things that come out from that. You know, there's paladins, there's alignment language, there's elves and swan mays and various other creatures. Here it's going to be a bit tougher. The basic principle is it's a Norse saga refictionized, retold for the modern day. You know, it's a new Norse saga, really wonderfully realized new Norse saga of a changeling, a half elf, half troll swapped into a human family, the human being taken into the elven court, and trouble brewing between elves and trolls and other things in the supernatural world. And there are obviously therefore genre similarities with D&D. Michael Moorcock sees this, and this is a massive influence on Elric. I'll touch on that again, but this is a great book. He would go so far as to say, I think incorrectly, to say it's better than Lord of the Rings. I think that's an issue of personal conviction, perhaps, about some of the things raised in those books. It's brooding and sad. What this all means, though, in terms of, I say, oh yeah, there's genre of crossovers, but this brooding, sad, melancholic, whipped together by the weird and the work of the Norns, is that in terms of old school D&D, it's not very close in terms of actual genre at the table. You might have more of this in more modern types of D&D, certain expectations of that at the table, but it's the opposite of a D&D campaign in that sense. By that I mean in terms of the overall feel. There are some things. I've got a few areas where I think you can draw out a couple of probable points of contact. There's fairly few direct points of contact, but a couple of probable ones, and then I'll mention someone else's theory, which I think is quite significant. First, white dragons. There is a icy white worm who, at one point, the heroes was Scaflock, who is the foster child into the elf court, and Manan and Maclear, the Irish she-lord who's come to help him. They have to fight an ice worm, and it's a dragon, and it's all icy and cold. I don't know. There are probably some other influences, but the idea of dragons who don't just have fire but many other things. There are a few other classical sources, but this is a source we know Gygax knew and loved. Again, I suppose some of the stuff in Deities and Demigods, the first edition version thereof by two close friends of Gygax, probably influenced by the bestiary here, and the kind of different species of gods or godlings that you meet. The elves and trolls probably do partly influence elves and trolls in D&D, though not very much. Trolls are more like orcs, as has been pointed out. These trolls, I mean, are more like D&D orcs. And the elves are more classical, high, cruel, but beautiful and wonderful, but almost terrifyingly insane fey creatures. More like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and more like Elric. And that's a big draw from here, I think. Moorcock is massively influenced by this, and that does definitely influence, and you can see the influence in D&D. Another influence, which I think is probably, again, less from here perhaps for D&D than via Moorcock, is Magic Evil Sword. Stormbringer, but almost certainly based on the Broken Sword, this title. I think Moorcock might have even said so. And Stormbringer is definitely one of, if not the chief root of the intelligent sentient weapon trope, particularly the kind of evil or cursed weapon trope. And that comes probably for Moorcroft from here. So what we've said, dragon, we've said. Yeah, I was going to say about the elves. I forgot to add drow. Less the drow. So I think elves and orcs and trolls in D&D chiefly come from Tolkien. Tolkien is a massive influence despite Gary's later denials. But I think something that probably... So a dark, very aesthetic, cruel, callous elven species comes into D&D in the 70s in D3 in the Drow, and whatever the exact story there for Gary's development process, I cannot help but feel like this must be one. I mean, along with things like some of the stuff with Dunsany and elsewhere, this idea of a dark fairy land, which also goes on to influence Warhammer with Dark Eldar and stuff. Dark Elves and then Dark Eldar in 40k. I think that probably one of its modern roots is this book, as much or more than Moorcock. And I say that because, I say probably for Moorcock, the Games Workshop games probably are influenced by Moorcock directly. This, the elves are less utterly grotesque. The monstrosities they commit are less thoroughly gone into by the author, and there's more of a veil over them. And that certainly suits maybe more of how the Drow are presented, sometimes in G3 to D3. Those are the theories I have. I did read an interesting one by Ray Simmons at D.R.R. Books, which was more or less to the effect that there are things to do with how half-orcs, half-elves and clerics are presented in D&D, which feels like the way in which our two children of two worlds or three worlds are dealt with here, and particularly the advance in the story in the 1954 edition, especially the decline of the pagan pantheons and the advance of the White Christ across the northern lands, and this strange new power that can't be resisted, which is interestingly presented. The effects on the fairies are interestingly discussed, the way in which that certainly echoes Tolkien as well, in a very different way perhaps to what Tolkien would have said, but nonetheless something very similar. The way in which the cleric, who is a servant of the divine, gets, for the first couple of levels, the first level, second level spells, so up to fourth level, gets their spells direct. They know the rights to do them. Above that, they have to be granted those by celestial aids, and connecting that to the potential earthly and almost supernatural, perhaps that's the way, supernatural nature of elves and trolls and orcs being part of the behind. I think some of that is pushed a long way, possibly to breaking, but one, it's interesting and compelling. But to that point, that the vision of the Christian priest in Broken Sword, who's very much a background character, but nonetheless, the sense that character might be one of the influences on the cleric in OD&D, in first edition AD&D, I think is plausible because of some of the ways that the powers and the mindset certainly seem to work. Of course, Gary could have gone to many real life churches at the time for that, but I think in literary terms, the Broken Sword is probably one, I'd agree with that theory, which is drawn upon by Gary for the cleric. Anyway, that's my set of ideas. If you have more, put them in the comments, because I'm sure I've missed some. I guess I'll have to think about what's coming up next. But if you've got any more suggestions for Appendix N that you'd particularly like read, talked about, then add those too. Till next time.